Well, hello, friends, and welcome back to Barriers and Boundaries, Resilience Leadership. And we're talking about organizational leadership a lot of times on the show. And Mr. Paul Bruno, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to hear about this story and your work and just really how it contributes to the conversation that I'm trying to have here. Really excited about the books on the original Jeeps, the three manufacturers there, and the Jeep in pictures as well, and also an emphasis on project management in the third book there. Was that the first book or was that the third in their
Well, you can call it the
series there?
third book. It was actually the first one to come out, but it's also the third book that where we emphasized project management and the creation of the first Jeep. So either way you want to
Nice.
say it is correct. That's
Yeah.
rare in life. You're going to win either way. So there you go.
I like that. Especially here in Vegas, that's big on winning.
That's right. Exactly. Doesn't happen in the casinos, but hey, you're on the podcast. It's good. Winner. No problem.
Yeah. And you've been in Vegas a long time? You've worked in Vegas a long time?
Yeah, my late wife and I moved to Vegas in 1997, so almost 30 years, and just been my background is information technology of all crazy things, and I worked in that arena. Well, I still kind of do, as I originally, early on was more technical work, and then I went into management, then eventually into project management, which is how our paths crossed. And I've been an IT project manager for almost 25 years, which all these long, lengthy, decades long stuff means I'm just old. Thanks for having me on the show. Let me know. And it's all right. And but my other passion is history, and I have an MBA in marketing and a bachelor's in computer software and management, but I also have an MA in history. So I have kind of this dual a skill set. And so I married those skill sets when I started to become interested in the creation and development of the Jeep. In the first book we talked about, I married those into a project management book showing, project management throughout the creation and development of the Jeep. And then the other two books are more historical books, relying more on my MA in history, which tell the story more from a historical perspective. So, and last in the intro, how did I become interested in all this? People always ask. Number one, okay, in case your people want to know, no, I don't own a Jeep. Everybody always asks me that. I don't. I write about them and the early Jeep history. And I talk about early Jeep history is really from the end of World War One through the 20s and 30s up till 1942, when they which we'll probably talk a little bit about, finalized the contract to Ford to build the Willis MB under license. So I'm always say I'm an early Jeep historian. After that January 42, all the stuff that had with Jeep in history, I'm not your guy. Oh, and how I came interested in it was my late wife and I were writing screenplays around the 2000 time frame, and we found out, and we'll get into it, how the first Jeep came about, and we felt that would make a really good movie. 25 years later, it still hasn't happened. I still think it would be. In fact, I was just talking about it with somebody last night. I still think it would be a great movie. We have a script that's actually out there in the ether, but haven't been
Yeah.
able to get that done. But when the script stuff didn't work out at the end of the intro, we decided to write the books to tell the story to get it out there.
Nice. Well, I know they're working on getting Summerlin Studios out here in Vegas.
Well, breathing and healthy, I would talk to anybody about making the Jeep movie, as I like to call it, but we'll never know.
Taking it back to the book itself, the story of the Jeep, do you mind giving like an overview of what you discuss in that book and how it progressed through the three manufacturers and some of that general history there? Because I think there's a lot to learn from that.
Right. I think your emphasis in this podcast is on leadership, right?
Yes.
Varies about just the story is very broad and wide and deep. So I'll try to keep it to some of those key leadership things that happen throughout the development. So for your audience, so they can see some of the challenges that they had from a leadership position, and maybe they can think about what they would have done in those. So the overall story, the big macro picture is in the late 1930s, the U.S. Army, which was 17th in the world behind Bulgaria. It's hard to imagine that since all the money we spent on the military since the 1950s when we changed how we do things in terms of basically before the 1950s and the Cold War, after every war, the army would demobilize and become very small. And so that happened in the 20s and the 30s after World War One. And in the 30s, they were starved for money because of the Great Depression. And so in the late 1930s, they was not a very powerful military force. They could see that Europe was probably heading toward war again. Germany was rearming, and they needed a vehicle because mobility was becoming a much bigger. 20 years after the Great War, mobility was becoming one of the key factors really changing in the military realm at that time. And they really didn't have a vehicle to move troops and small payloads that would replace the horse and the mule, which had shown, the horse and mule going up against machine guns. That didn't go well in World War One. So they looked in the late
Surprise.
30s. Exactly. Yeah, that's not going to go well. So in the late 1930s, there was some experimentation, da 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 da, but they didn't really find a solution. So in May 1940, the Army really didn't have any kind of solution to the problem. And that's kind of where the creation development of Jeep starts is, again, the big overview. There was a serendipitous meeting in the infantry using branch between a representative of the American Bantam Car Company, which no one's ever heard of, which was a small car manufacturer that was basically bankrupt. This is why I think it would make a good movie. You have a bankrupt small company in a place called Butler, Pennsylvania, and now most people know about Butler, Pennsylvania because of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump there and or that's the same exact place is where that happened, is where the first Jeep was created. And through a whole series of amazing circumstances, starting in late May 1940, they developed a memo for June 6, 1940, which was a general concept of what they wanted. That went through a whole series of machinations to become a documents that they could build a vehicle to. They went out to bid to build 70. American Bantam won that award. Willis Overland and Ford would later come into the picture. Willis Overland, which did not win that bid in July 1940, built a what they called pilot model on their own. So the first Jeep that Bantam built, the first Jeep that Willis built on their own dime and delivered in November 1940 was their pilot model, and then Ford built the pilot model between October and also later November 1940. Built their pilot model in the astonishing time frame of 49 days, which was considered impossible between August 5th and September 23rd, 1940. So that's kind of the origin story for the first three Jeeps and the big macro.
Yeah, and from a leadership perspective, I'm thinking about how much it's all requirements based, it's needs based. There was a need, they had the ability to think this through. Then there's a little bit of luck with the chance meeting, right? But it really kinda starts with the leader thinking, using his brain or her brain in a way that's like, what do we not have? What do we need here? What do we not have that we could definitely use and gain some advantage here? How often in your career has needs just come down to the ability to think through an issue?
Yeah, that's true. And a little of the details, high level, going to your point about thinking from a leadership standpoint, they didn't really know what they wanted even after they came up with this general concept in June 6, 1940. So the Army went to Butler and they had a lot of discussions in terms of what they thought the vehicle would be like and look like. And if I can share, I can show the concept drawing to your audience. So when they went to Butler, this is a concept drawing that they created, which, as you can see from their thinking, they're already getting an idea of what the Jeep would look like. And for your audience, what I love about this, every Jeep that's ever been built, this is the origin story. It comes back to this concept drawing. So that's an amazing thing. All
That
right.
is. That's an
So
amazing
what I
picture
can
there.
do is then, but going to your point, they had to go back and refine everything. And over a 3 week period, going to your point about thinking, they refined the documents to create a specification they could build from in terms of the Jeep. And this is the concept. This is the quartermaster drawing, the actual one that they created from that concept drawing. And people can see there the much greater outlines of a Jeep. I don't know if they can see my pointer, but you can see they really refined it more there at the bottom. They refined it more. And I'll see if I can bring up the next slide. And there's some even more detail for people from that drawing. And it was this drawing plus the specification they called ES 475 that they sent out to 135 companies to bid on. And Bantam won that bid. But again, every Jeep ever created comes from that. If you can see at the bottom there, comes from that
Yep.
drawing. From that drawing, every single Jeep, that first concept drawing, then this quartermaster drawing, every Jeep comes from that. And I find that amazing. But going to your point, in a 3-week period at warp speed, the leadership that was needed was incredible in terms of being able to create something that people could build a vehicle to. 3 weeks. They went from that concept drawing people saw to that quartermaster drawing and a 17-page specification. So there was some really great leadership going on from the quartermaster.
And just a lot of curiosity of what could be. I think curiosity is one of the best characteristics a leader could have.
Yeah, and when you think about, they went from May where they had nothing to mid-July where they had that quartermaster drawing that you could see for a vehicle that had never been created, and it was revolutionary in a sense. All the things they wanted in it had never been done. No single piece was new, but combining them in a small vehicle that could do all the things they wanted this new vehicle to do was unique.
Yeah, and the
Go ahead.
I was saying the ability to create such a game changer in that environment, that context, completely altering of the complete industry there.
Yeah, that you don't know. And just from a leadership standpoint, some of the things I mentioned in the presentation you went to that happened through the bid and the original build is the weight the Army wanted for the vehicle was completely impossible. Basically, the short version is that Bantam basically lied on their bid, saying they could build it to the weight. And they also basically lied, saying they could build it in 49 days, where they had no idea they could build it in 49 days because they were bankrupt and they wanted the contract. So, from a leadership standpoint, I always bring that up is that what would you do in that situation? You're a bankrupt company. You know, these two requirements are basically completely unreasonable and impossible. Willis was actually honest about it and said, we can't build a vehicle in 75 days. And they lost the bid to build the first one, the first 70 because of that, because they were penalized. Where eventually Bantam did deliver in 49 days. They did not deliver on the weight because the weight was impossible. And in the book, I go through the whole story of that. It's really an amazing story about basically fibbed. So that's an ethical question in terms of, well, what do you do when what you'd want to do as a project manager is go to the stakeholder and go, we really and Willis tried to do this. We need to negotiate on this requirement, but the government wouldn't negotiate on it. The quartermaster's like, no, it needs to be 1,300 pounds and it needs to be done in 49 days. So what do you do there? So I leave that to your audience who's listening to ponder. Those again from a leadership standpoint. What do you do there?
Yeah.
I wonder what I would do in that situation.
Hey, can you talk about some of the challenges that they had to face? Obviously, the timeline, the weight, the economy in the US, or any challenges that come to mind
Yeah, the
for them
biggest
developing this?
no, that's a really good question. The biggest challenge is from a micro perspective, because once they were building it, it was kind of like, Dan's got to build this or not. Was never this type of vehicle never been built, but they were small car experts, and this was a small car. Was basically determining the size of the engine, okay, because of the weight requirement. So they went with a 40 horsepower engine. And we'll talk a little, maybe we'll have a chance to talk a little about Willis's journey with their engine. And then just these guys were amazingly talented people, hands-on. This was toward the end of the early period of automotive history from 1900 to 1940. So most of these guys had learned their trade in the 1920s and 30s. So they were all hands-on. So they literally built parts and then did the blueprints. And the biggest challenge was just, and like I mentioned, anyone here is a project manager. They kind of used an agile approach where they just did sprints and they just kind of solved problems as they had to, was just figuring out how they're going to put it all together. But the biggest component that was an issue was they needed a designed from scratch front axle for the 4x4. And there was only one company in the country that could do it, called Spicer Axle. So from a leadership standpoint, they had brought Spicer Axle in from the when people saw that concept drawing from June of 20th, 1940. They had included Spicer in the discussions. So Spicer wasn't caught off guard, but Spicer had to modify a Studebaker axle and use a lot of imagination to create the front axle in that, compressed time frame and deliver it to Bantam by September 15th, 1940. They also, real quick, they also built the front axle for Willis, who was building their pilot model on the side because the quartermaster had worked out a deal with them. They also built the front axle for that. So that was kind of the challenges they had from a micro perspective under a hugely compressed time frame.
And I would imagine the chaos internally with the messaging and the urgency that was portrayed. Say you're a brand new leader, what would be something that you would want to company-wide press or impress upon your staff, with a challenge like that? Just to kind of play an armchair quarterback to, leading a organization through that period.
I think what they all knew was this was an all or nothing situation. They had to basically complete this prototype pilot model on time or the company was going under for good. So you talk about the stakes being high. It was like for Bantam. So that would be one thing from a leadership perspective. And then let them know the core team that was building it. I know you can get this done. You have the talent, even though it seems impossible 49 days. And I'm here to support you in any way that we can. The president of the company, Frank Fenn, that's kind of what he did. He let the technical team do their thing, but in terms of making sure they procured parts on time, running any interference that needed with the Army, who was monitoring the situation, so on and so forth, as the key stakeholder. But those would have been the two things that I would have impressed upon that team. And, that's a lot of pressure. And
Sure.
I have some firsthand reminiscence from some of the people that built the first Jeep, and he talked about it. He said, we'd solve one problem, we'd get some work done, I'd go home to sleep, and the head of the team would call me up immediately and go, "Ralph, come back, we got another problem." So they didn't, they worked so hard as he related, and just to come up with, you know, day in and day out for 49 days.
And that's actually that ties into, like, the name Barriers and Boundaries of the podcast, as looking at the job of a leader is to, 1, put in some healthy boundaries for their employees to work through, but also remove obstacles, remove barriers that are preventing them from actually getting their job done. So I see, like, that twofold agenda for a leader, and, man, there's so much in the story that speaks to that specifically.
Yeah, there was a lot of barriers, when they were developing the specifications. They did this test on a hill, and they thought the quartermaster, while they're developing that quartermaster drawing I showed, and the whole vehicle failed. And the quartermaster's like, "Well, we're done." But one of the band of people was there, and he said, "No, don't worry about that. We're already working on getting more powerful engine." So again, overcoming the barrier after technical challenge, as I talked about with the axle, or just figuring out how this thing is going to be put together from basically no idea. It's from through the concept drawing and then the quartermaster. So yeah, there was a lot of that going on. And again, it's detailed in the book. And Willis's story, as anyone knows the Jeep, they cut a side deal. That's a whole nother thing with the Army in terms of we will build a prototype pilot model on our own. So there's a whole bunch of ethical questions there. Is like, well, you just let a contract for 70 to another company and you're letting this company build on the side. Well, that was Willis's, from their point of view, it was like, well, their berries and boundary. They had to decide, do we want to spend our own money with no guarantee that we'll get anything out of this? and that ended up being $35,000 in 1940 money, which was a lot of money back then. But they took the risk, and again, that's leadership. They took that risk, and they were able to build their pilot model with a lot of the same challenges, but it took them 75 days. So they took longer to solve all the different challenges. And Bantam just basically threw it together. And what's amazing is the Bantam's pilot model survived testing with challenges, but it made it all the way through testing. So you're building this vehicle that's revolutionary, never been done, that was going to go to the army, and they were going to do everything they could to try to break it, and they couldn't do it. That's the very first Jeep that we've been talking about, created by the American Bantam Car Company on September 21st, 1940. 10 minutes after it was completed, the project team rolled it out. It didn't even have any gas in it. And they sat in it, and someone knew they had done something historic, so they took a picture. And
That's amazing.
yeah, that's an iconic picture in terms of now people could see they went from nothing to that concept drawing to the quartermaster drawing and the other specification that I haven't shown. And here is really, and you could see that's a Jeep, you know,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
amazing. And they delivered it 2 days later at 4:30 in the afternoon on the 49th day of, with a half an hour to spare, which is why it'd make a great movie. And you could see the evolution that was overcoming all the barriers and boundaries. That's what they did. And I think that's
Yeah.
pretty amazing.
Yeah. No, that is. So they get this out there, they meet the 49-day deadline. What happens next?
Yeah, the Bantam prototype, which people just saw, passes testing. Willis delivers their vehicle on November 13th, and Ford delivers their vehicle on November 23rd. So they're all going through testing. And now going to the point is the Army had absolutely no plan after Bantam delivered their vehicle and it passed testing of what they're going to do next. They're literally making it up on the fly. It's like, well, all right. So the short version is first they came up, they were going to give 500 to Bantam. So the first three models are known as pilot models. Okay. So they're going through all this machinations, bureaucratic machination, which go into barriers and boundaries. The amount of leadership the Bantam, Willis, and Ford people had to show here to get through this morass of bureaucracy, which I'm going to describe briefly, was amazing. So here you go from they had to have all this technical leadership going to barriers and boundaries to create the vehicles. Now you have to have all this leadership to get through all this Army bureaucracy. So they're going to do 500 to Bantam, and Willis and Ford object to that. Then they're going to do 500 to each, and Bantam objects to that, and other people object to that because the ironclad rule, which could not ever be broken unless Jesus returned, was you can't give out a contract unless they have an approved, tested, and approved prototype. Absolutely ironclad, could not be done, except when they decide not to follow that. And so what happened is the Army says, no, now we're going to give 1,500 to Bantam. So they combine the 500 for the three and going to have Bantam build 1,500. But Willis and Ford go crazy about that. And then basically by December 3rd, the tops of the Army overrules the quartermaster and says, even though Ford and Willis do not have an tested and approved prototype, yeah, they're going to get a contract for 1,500 too.
Wow. Wow.
You can't make that stuff up.
Mm.
So they got to the point where each vendor now was going to build 1,500, and they called those their experimental models. So the one on the left, that is Willis's prototype, and the one on the right, that's actually me standing in front of the Ford Pygmy, which was Ford's prototype that they delivered on November 23rd, 1940. It still exists.
Wow.
That's the actual vehicle. It's in a museum in Huntsville, Alabama. So that's the third Jeep ever built that people can see over my left shoulder. That was quite a moment for me because to be able to stand next to this vehicle that I had written about. So
Yeah, of
that was
course.
that was pretty amazing. So each has a contract for 1,500. Bantam starts building their 1,500, and the seventh Bantam ever built, which was one of the first 70, it still exists. It's in the Heinz Museum in Pittsburgh. His nickname is Gramps. So you have the Ford Pygmy is the oldest Jeep that exists, and the second oldest Jeep, which was completed on December 7th, 1940, which is a Bantam, uh, still still is on display in a museum in Pittsburgh, which is amazing. So they had to build their 1500. So Ford vehicle passed testing, so they started building their 1500, but the Willis Quad failed testing. And again, through in late January 1941 into February 1943, there was a whole nother firestorm. And now we're already at the third time Willis is almost out of the picture. First, they lost the bid for the first 70, and they stayed the course there. And then they stayed the course with the contract for 1500. And now they're almost out again. And so, through a whole nother great leadership on Willis's part, they were able to work through that to where the quartermaster said, well, even though your prototype failed testing, take everything that you learned from testing and all the feedback we're giving you and start building your 1500. So again, just made it up as they go along. One thing I wanted to mention in terms of leadership, barriers and boundaries, with the weight requirement being so ridiculous, head of engineering, a guy named Delmar Ruse, he wanted to use an engine they had that had 60 horsepower. Now, Bantam used a 40 horsepower engine and Ford used a 40 horsepower engine because of the weight requirements. This is the decision you have to make as a leader, right? But Delmar Ruse knew that more power in a military vehicle was always needed. And so they went with their heavier 60 horsepower engine. And the Army actually told them to get rid of it. And they stuck with it. And finally, the Army realized that this vehicle is going to weigh 2,160 pounds. So the weight came up enough where Willis could meet it with their engine. But taking that leadership stand, Delmar Ruse, and sticking with it, even though knowing it was the right decision, even with your vehicle failing testing. And I really think it failed testing structurally because they had to cheat so much to try to keep the weight down. And the quad still came in at 2,400 pounds because they had that heavier engine. But that's a real leadership thing. And when I talk about the MB, I'll tell you how important it was that they took that barrier and said, we are sticking with the 60 horsepower engine because no, it's the right thing to do, even if we lose out. And that's not an easy decision to make from a leadership standpoint.
All the stakeholder engagement, the communication that has to happen, but weighing those types of risk and saying they need to see the true value. So for me, that brings up an interesting point. Sometimes you might be the smartest person in the room, but you kind of have to slow down to let everyone catch up to what your thinking is. Let me help them turn the light bulb on.
That's a really good point. They had to take the time for the Army, the key stakeholder, who the crane is, to see that having the heavier engine was really going to be beneficial. And you're right. That's what makes the story so great is from a project management or a leadership perspective is you have all these stakeholders, you have a revolutionary new vehicle, you have three vendors vying for the contract with all that. You have various parts of the Army, you have infantry, cavalry, you have the adjutant general, the chief of staff's office, all this going on all at once. And the leaders had to try to navigate all that, especially from the vendor side. And it's just an amazing thing in terms of going on. Willis went back and refined the quad, which we have shown, and their vehicle changed so much, they decided to change the naming on it, and they decided to call it the military vehicle. And because this was the first version of it, they gave it the letter A. Very complicated. And the thing is, though, if you look, I don't know if people could see, but you see the hood there, and it says Willis on the front. You got to give Willis credit for, chutzpah. Yeah, let's have a government vehicle put our name on it. But there's a 60 horsepower engine under that. There's a Willis MA in the desert being tested, and there's me again over my left shoulder in that same museum. There's only 30 of these left because they built 1,500 of them, a Willis MA. And that was another really great moment for me standing in front of a Willis MA. And because it had the more powerful engine, and this is how you know in that desert shot that that's an MA because you see the Willis on the front of it, right? So that was an amazing moment for me to stand in front of only one of 30 Willis MAs left. And it was an amazing Jeep with that 60 horsepower engine and all the refinements they had done on it. And just in case, I don't know if people can see it, I'm circling third down on the left, the photograph, that's Delmar Ruse. That's the leader who said, we are going to stick with this engine at 60 horsepower no matter what. Truly an amazing engineer. You can see the evolution there in terms of the vehicle getting better.
Yeah.
Early Jeep history can be broken up into three phases. We talked about the early phase, which was the building of the first one, and that went from end of World War One, but especially May 1940 to about October 1940. Then you add to build 1,500 experimental models of Bantam, Ford, and Willis. That went to about March 1941. And the third piece of early Jeep history, which you can talk about from a leadership standpoint, is went from about April 1941 to January 1942, which I mentioned earlier.
Nice. And just to put into context, like we have the luxury of looking back on this through the lens of history, but to be that type of engineer with that kind of foresight, even with the history of the army dismantling, so to speak, after war, like there was no guarantees of like the industry of the military we have today. But to still go out and say, no, this is the right thing to do. Much different story today with over half of the military, the defense budget and contracts. Just an insane effort, one, to do the right thing for your customer and just to stand on that hill, die on that hill, essentially.
Now, that's a really good point. When you look at it, that okay, Bantam got a contract for 70. They did all this engineering, created this amazing vehicle, which people actually saw. They had no idea if they'd get anything more after that. And Willis didn't know if they'd even get anything building the quad. They put $35,000 in. And now Ford, the quartermaster, actually asked them to come and build the vehicle. Okay, so that's a whole nother leadership angle here that we haven't talked about. Is that really ethical? You already have two vendors. Well, let's bring a third in, right? Because they wanted Ford. And then they gave Ford, because it was October 1940, all the information that basically Willis and Bantam had pioneered. So that's why Ford was able to build their pilot in like 5 or 6 weeks, because they built upon all that Ford and Bantam and Willis had already done. And basically, given that as a government procurement, well, government stuff, they can do what they want. So technically, it wasn't unethical, but it is what it was. Yeah, then when they got to 1,500, they had no idea what the Army was going to do next, because the Army didn't know. So what happened after that is they sent the 1,500 of each, so you had 4,500 as they were coming out around the country for testing, and I detail that in a chapter in my book. But then in late June and July, into early July 1941, the Army decides, hey, we've got three really good vehicles. They were all really good. The MA, which I showed, was a step above because of that more powerful engine, and they were kind of starting to realize that. But the Army just decided themselves, we're going to go out for a winner-take-all contract among anyone who decides to bid for 16,000. So in a year, like I say, going from this is the scope that's changing with the war expanding from, Germany conquered France in the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain, but they knew that the war had expanded greatly. They were at then all the tensions over that year in the Pacific. So the Army was starting to figure, and you have to understand, going to your point about real time, these guys had never experienced anything on the scale of World War II. They had World War One, but that was pretty contained compared to what was going to happen. So they're learning on the fly of how much they're needing unprecedented amounts of equipment and material already before they're in the war. So they go from we need 70, then 1,500 or 4,500. Now it's four times more, 16,000. And so they let out a bid for that 16,000, and they couldn't even scrap together $175,000 in 1940 to build the 470. This was going to be a contract for $12 million in 1941 money. And yeah, that's what I do. It's like I've been doing
Wow.
this for 25 years, and I shake my head, going like, "Wow, how do you wrap your head around that?" So there's a whole bunch of stories, good leadership stories here. So they let out the contract for 16,000, and the short version is basically it's either going to be Bantam, Ford, and Willis, right? And the Army was the quartermaster, which again, more detail in the book. They were totally Ford biased for whatever reason. So the bids come in, and they basically write this memo, which I've actually held in my hand, written July 31st, 1941, where the quartermaster, the short version of the memo is Bantam and Willis are horrible, and Ford walks on water. Therefore, Ford should get the 16,000. Thank you for coming, Bantam and Willis, right? So this is amazing stuff. If people have been in project management or just been in organizations, right? So it goes up the chain of command. And the long story short, this one guy that had to approve it, he said no. Willis has an acceptable vehicle at the lowest price, and quartermaster, I want you to award this to Willis. Now, this guy that made this decision had been a former Ford employee that had gone to GM, but was now working in the government. Again, all detailed in the book. And I'm not sure how much he really liked Henry Ford. Oh, there could have been an element of personal stuff in there, but it was the right decision because you're supposed to, if you have an acceptable product, it's supposed to go to the low bidder. Okay. Now, they don't always follow that because you can make exceptions, but that's what he did. Now, through serendipity, here we are again. It's all started serendipitous meeting in May 1940 that I mentioned way earlier between Bantam and the infantry. Actually, because he made this decision, he picked the best vehicle. Now, to tie it all back together, because the Willis vehicle had the 60 horsepower. And because of that, I think the Jeeps in the war, because if it had been awarded to Ford, I think they would have used the 40 horsepower engine. And that may not have been able to do everything was able to do. Having, that 1/3 more horsepower where the Jeep ended up being, which was everywhere, was a huge advantage. And if I
Yeah.
can, I'll share real quick for your audience, and I'll explain that to wrap it all up again from a leadership standpoint. So there's the Willis MB. That was the vehicle for the war, and how it became NB, if anybody's heard that term, is they made so many changes after they awarded the 16,000 contract, they gave it the next letter up. Again, very complicated. So you went from the MA to the MB, and that's how they got it. And there's me on the far picture on the right, I guess, at least for me.
Mhm.
That's a Willis MB, but it's called the slat grill because the first 25,000 had a grill like that. And then after the 25,000, Ford, who we'll talk about here to wrap everything up, had developed a better grill. So that's a very, very early Willis MB, which is right next to the Willis MA I was standing at before. This again goes to the scope. Willis is going to build 16,000. So they go back and they're doing the MB. Now they awarded the 16,000 August 1st or so, 1941, right? So by October 1941, they're like Jaws. We're going to need a bigger boat. Okay. We're going to need a lot more of these, right? And so only in 2 months. And so they go to Willis and they say, I always talk about it. I think I did it at the presentation. I call it the Godfather offer. It's like, oh, Willis, well, what would it take to build, your vehicle under license? And it's like, an offer they can't refuse because they need the government contract. So they write a letter, which I actually have, October 10th, 1941, and say, this is what we need for you to build on our license. The Army quartermaster gets that. They wanted Ford so badly, they had got approval in 3 weeks to award 15,000 to Ford to build the MB under license. And Ford called their vehicles GPs after they came up. The first vehicle was called the Pygmy, but then the 1500 they called the GP, which actually they called the Pygmy a GP, which stood for government, and the P was a vehicle with 80-inch wheelbase. So they nicknamed it the Pygmy, but it was really the GP1. Then the 1500 they built were just known as Ford GPs. So they decided to call the vehicle they would build under license the GPW for government vehicle with 80-inch wheelbase Willis. So that's how you got the term GPW. But the Ford GPW built from 1942 on for the war, and they built 270,000 of them. It's basically the MB under license. And they're basically as close to identical vehicles as possible because they wanted to be standardized. But again, leadership standpoint, Willis didn't really have much of a choice. They had to say, well, they're saying we can't build enough of these. And Willis ended up building 360,000 Jeeps. They did what they had to do. And, from the quartermaster standpoint, they really wanted Ford involved because of their manufacturing capacity. Again, leadership decision. But that left Bantam out in the cold. And Bantam, who basically built the first Jeep, didn't build any Jeeps for the war, which is always kind of a sad note. But they were bankrupt, they were small, and the Army just felt overall that they just were too small a player and they got forced out.
Thank you so much for your time. How do people find your books? How do they learn more about you and connect with you? And
I appreciate that. One more share here, young man. So hang on here. I'm doing pretty good with the tech today. I'm a tech guy, but I kid around about, being a little older, but so this is nice that you mentioned all three books. So that's all three books, and they're all available on Amazon. And what I tell people is the blue book on at least on my far left is the detailed historical account. And I don't like to mislead people. No, it's not a page turner, but it's I like hopefully think it's an interesting book, but it's one where you kind of read chapter by chapter. And so we created a much easier read book, the original Jeeps and Pictures, which basically people can read in an hour, which allows people to get the real basics of the story in images. And I included some of the key documentation there that people had never seen. And then the last book on the right is the one that is more of a project management case study book. So if someone has an interest from a project management standpoint, they can buy that book. The blue book and the case study book, they're $20, and the green book's $11. So they're not a huge investment in terms of buying them. And I tell people, look, if you don't want to, if you just want to learn the story, buy the blue book or the green book or both. And if you buy both the green book and the blue book, the original Jeeps and real Jeeps and pictures, you'll have the whole story. So that's kind of it. We have a Facebook page, the original Jeeps, and a website, originaljeeps.com, that people can go to if they like.
I'll put them in the description as well, so then you have
Good, good.
immediate
So
access
I
to that.
appreciate that, and appreciate just I try to be honest about that. I don't want people to buy all three and go like, there's overlap. It's like either buy the original Jeeps, the original Jeeps and pictures, or both, or if you really want to have a nice project management case study thing and learn from
Yeah,
it, buy the project management history, the first Jeep.
the case study book, such a good tool. I think case studies are so good for just developing your skill set as a project manager. Just putting yourself in different scenarios, allowing yourself the freedom without the time constraint, like what they were going through 49 days, allowing your team to develop their thinking skills and, how would you handle this? And a lot of times it just comes down to how do you control chaos and really being able to work through and communicate well and engage with the stakeholders well and all that stuff. So no, I very much appreciate you coming on the podcast and telling that story, writing that book, getting that out there. And like I said, I love to champion development, whether it's leadership development or organizational development. And I found that story when you shared it, I was like, oh, that really touches on kind of both aspects. So thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
No, I really fit into your barriers and boundaries and leadership, among many other things. And yeah, there was some. What the case study book is, we also included questions from both an entrepreneurial mindset and a project management mindset. So going to your point, yeah, I think it's a valuable read from a learning standpoint. If just all the things they had to go through that we kind of mentioned, and you did a really good job leading me through it, from the big picture, all the things they had to go through, from stakeholder management, risk, planning, bureaucracy, conflict, the whole thing. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, very
Really a great story.
contextual.
It's an iconic story, and what's really nice about it, to wrap it up, is it's about a product that everybody knows, the Jeep. That's still here. That's what's amazing, is these original Jeeps that they built, every Jeep you see on the road comes from them. So people can relate to it. It's not something way back in history that people don't see anymore. And
Right.
it's both a military and civilian, and it's a vehicle that was key to winning the biggest, most expensive, destructive war in history. And it's just
Yeah.
mind-boggling.
How often do you get asked about the GP versus Jeep, calling it Jeep based on GP title?
Yeah, I get asked that about a lot. I didn't mention the court case that was done during the war, but they did this court case, which I mentioned at the presentation you went through, and they deposed all these people that had stuff to do with the creation of the Jeep, and they really could not determine, and this was like 1943, 1944, or 45, still during the war, how the Jeep name actually came to be associated with what they called the quarter ton 4x4 light. So it's still a mystery. There's the GP that was Jeep. There's the Popeye comic strip that was the Jeep. There's the that was a slang term that they used that eventually just got singular use for the quarter ton, what they called the quarter ton 4x4 light. I don't think we'll
Yeah.
ever really know
Yeah.
because if they did a court case and deposed everybody that they could possibly find that had something to do with the crazy melt in the Jeep and they couldn't figure it out then, 85 years on, we're probably not going to figure it out. But that's okay.
Yeah, that's cool. I like the air of mystery around it, so that's good. So, all right. Well, hey, thank you, Paul. I appreciate your time and you coming to share your story. And cheers to you. And we'll look forward to seeing what happens in the future. Hopefully, that script works out for you.
Thank you for having me on. It was a blessing and a privilege.
Thank you. All right, my friends, that was Paul Bruno. Check out the original Jeep, check out the books, check out the links to his Facebook group, and really just I encourage you to think about what this means in your context and your organization. What are you going through as a leader right now? What are ways that you can build resilience just by hearing about a story like this and applying it to your own context? So, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Looking forward to how you are developing your own resilience. And let's keep fighting the good fight and let's stay strong and stay resilient. Grace and peace to you, my friends. EB out.